All right, it looks like we're now live for our monthly political theory and practice discussion. So I picked out something that comes up every once in a while in contemporary politics, and we could say in the culture of war. And it's, so just put it on the table. It's the Grand Inquisitor chapter from the Brothers Karamazov. And the is that any simplistic treatment of the Grand Inquisitor chapter, like any other great piece of classic literature, is going to be off base and wrong and probably stand in the way of actually understanding what's going on and what's being said in that. There is no simple application of the Grand Inquisitor chapter. So anybody who tells you that there is either poorly informed or not a very good reader, or is trying to sell you some line, some sort of ideology. And I think that it would be good to talk about some of the central features of this, and then some of the uses that people have made of it, and then what we can actually make of the big themes in the Grand Inquisitor. So, it's in the context of this book, The Brothers Karamazov, which is a great piece of literature. We're not going to talk about the Brothers Karamazov per se. There's lots of other interesting things going on in the book, but I don't particularly care that much about them as far as this discussion goes. Nor is this, of course, an AMA where we're going to go all over the map and talk about all sorts of other things in philosophy as well. We're going to talk about this chapter in particular. So Ivan is back in town, and he's talking with his younger brother, Alyosha, who is essentially preparing himself for the monastic life. Ivan is, essentially an unbeliever, but he's an unbeliever in Christianity in the sense that not of a dogmatic atheist who says, oh, this is all mythology, this can't possibly be true. If you read the previous chapter, Rebellion, it's rather that he's got a beef with God and the kind of world and the kind of human society that God allows to be set up and to victimize so many people. And so he comes up with this thing that he calls a poem. I'm actually going to read bits and pieces of this to you, and then we can comment on them and discuss them. So he says, my action takes place in the 16th century. Back then, by the way, you must have learned this in school, it was customary in poetic works to bring higher powers down to earth. And that's what Ivan is doing. He's bringing Christ back to earth. And he says, okay, so I've got my own little poem. I'm skipping ahead a little bit. Here we go. So Christ desired to appear to his people, if only for a moment, to his tormented, suffering people, rank with sin, but loving him like children. This is the time of the Inquisition in Spain. And he says that he appeared inconspicuously, but strange to say, everyone recognized him. This could be one of the best passages in the poem. And I'm going to point this out. So Ivan, we normally talk about breaking the fourth wall when it comes to like television or film, where a character like turns to you and says, "Can you believe this crap?" Or and then I was doing this, or things like that. That's happening with Ivan as he is presenting to Alyosha, and as Dostoevsky through Ivan is presenting to us, the readers, this poem, this literary work that is not written down, except in Dostoevsky. It's not written down by Ivan. Ivan is commenting on it every so often, and he and Alyosha will chitter-chat back and forth about it. So this is the first place where he brings it up. He says, why is it exactly they recognize him? People are drawn to him by an invincible force. They flock to him, surround him, follow him. He passes silently among them with a quiet smile of infinite compassion. The sun of love shines in his heart, rays of light, enlightenment, and power stream from his eyes. So there's very miraculous stuff, right, going on. And then he does a miracle. He brings a dead girl back to life, and the Grand Inquisitor is like, all right, we're going to put an end to this stuff. And so he has him arrested. And then in his cell, there's this confrontation. And this confrontation is what takes up the bulk of the chapter. And this confrontation, which is entirely, put in the mouth of the Grand Inquisitor, with Ivan and Alyosha every once in a while saying something, sort of stepping out of frame, is going to be the Grand Inquisitor presenting a case essentially against Christ and the freedom that he was to bring. But here's where we get political implications for it, especially if we think about politics not just in terms of elections and stuff like that, or as a particular discipline, but in a very broad sense is that which determines a lot of human existence through culture, society, organization, all of that. So we wind up seeing the Grand Inquisitor telling Christ, "You don't belong here anymore. You shouldn't have come, and I'm going to tell you why we have effectively replaced you." Since people are chiming in at this point, I want to make sure that I echo something that I said at the beginning. No simple interpretation of the Grand Inquisitor chapter is a good interpretation. It's a complex piece of literature, and anybody who tries to sell us, it's just about this, is basically either, deluded or selling us a line or something like that. It's a rich piece of classic literature with many different important facets to it that we can get into. So in any case, the Grand Inquisitor, coming back to the actual story, right? I'm going to read a little passage. This is Ivan talking to Alyosha. He says, "The Grand Inquisitor lays it to his and his colleagues' credit that they have finally overcome freedom." This is the grand theme that often gets picked up on. People are like, "Oh, this is all about overcoming freedom in oppressive totalitarian societies." So that, again, that's a simple-minded approach to it. There's more going on here. And so Ivan says they've finally overcome freedom and have done so in order to make people happy, for only now has it become possible for the first time to think about human happiness. Man was made a rebel. How can rebels be happy? That is a central problematic about this. And the Grand Inquisitor, later on in the story, tells Christ that, listen, you came and you didn't do the things that you should have done in order to make human beings happy. Instead, you gave them this freedom that they already had, but you sort of intensified that freedom, and you, in effect, did things that worked out good for the strong, but made the rest of humanity unhappy as a result. We're here to fix that. And the Grand Inquisitor presents himself as, he talks about the strong at two different points. There's the strong who are like, all this religious bullshit, we're going to put it aside. That's one kind of strong. And then there's the strong who are like, well, we could use this and finally bring about something like not even a utopia on Earth, but something better than this crap that we're cyclically going through all the time with, rich people dominating things, or the powerful in the sense of the politically powerful running things and not knowing what they're doing. As Ivan says, the Grand Inquisitor joins the intelligent people, the elites, who actually are not just saying, let's screw everybody over, get everything for ourselves. They're like, wow, things are messed up. Human beings are making a bad use of their freedom. We need to fix this, and we can fix this. So that is the fundamental conflict there. What really centers the piece is the biblical story in Matthew in particular of the three temptations. And so here we go. The dread and intelligent spirit, the spirit of self-destruction and non-being, the great spirit spoke to you in the wilderness. This is the Grand Inquisitor speaking to Christ. And it has been passed on in books to us that he supposedly tempted you. Did he really? And was it possible to say anything more true than what he proclaimed to you in his three questions? So here we get to the real centerpiece of the chapter. And he says, this is the Grand Inquisitor, if a real thundering miracle was performed on earth, it was on that day, the day of those three temptations. So what are those three temptations? Christ has been fasting out in the desert for 40 days, and the devil comes in and says, "Why don't you take those stones over there and turn them into loaves of bread? You look pretty hungry, guy." And Christ says, each time he responds with a passage from Scripture, "Man does not live by bread alone." You've all heard that phrase, right? And the Grand Inquisitor is saying, actually, they do live by bread alone and meat and all this other stuff, all these other creature comforts. So that's one of the temptations. Then another one of the temptations is a temptation to a kind of pride, a kind of checking to see whether you really are the favorite of God. Jump from this high point, on the top of the temple. The angels will catch you, and Christ says, "Don't tempt God." Um, and then the third temptation is the temptation of power. The devil says, "See all these kingdoms of the earth, I will give you dominion over all of these, and all you have to do is say, essentially be my second in command, bow down to me." And in the biblical narrative, Christ rejects these. In the Grand Inquisitor's narrative, Christ screwed up by rejecting these and not taking the power that was being offered to him, whether by the devil or just by his own nature, which would have resulted in making human beings happy. And what is that? Well, he says, let's think about bread, right? You want to enter the world, you're going empty-handed with some promise of freedom, which they, human beings, in their simplicity and innate lawlessness, cannot even comprehend, which they dread and fear. Nothing has ever been more insufferable for man and for human society than freedom. See these stones, turn them into bread. Mankind will run after you like sheep, grateful and obedient. You didn't want to deprive human beings of freedom, and you rejected the offer. So what kind of freedom, you reasoned, if obedience is bought with loaves of bread? He says, you objected that man does not live by bread alone, but you do know that in the name of this very earthly bread, the spirit of the earth will rise against you and fight with you and defeat you, and everyone will follow him, exclaiming, "Who can compare to this beast, for he's given us fire from heaven?" And if you think about, not just bread, but all the other material circumstances that people are lacking, there's something to this, right? It's not as if this is just a stupid Grand Inquisitor who doesn't understand human nature. He understands human nature quite well. People are moved by material considerations. Then he moves on to the next challenge, the next temptation, which is that of miracles. Do a miracle, and people will buy into miracle, authority, superstition. All of this can be used to provide people not just with something to believe in, but something to feel confident about, something to center themselves with. And, again, this, to provide these sorts of things would impinge upon human freedom. And Dostoevsky's Ivan is positioning Christ as coming to expand human freedom, whereas the Grand Inquisitor is willing to get people to use their freedom, to throw that freedom at their feet so they can have a better organized society. And this brings us to the third temptation, that of power, that of being able to, finally make things work right. And what that requires is everybody to be part of one big, whatever we want to call it, community, conglomerate, everyone to be on the same page, everybody to worship the same things or a range of things, to be part of a society in which, things are organized. And, if you think about the uses of human freedom that lead people to, want that, we see this in every society, right? There's always jackasses that are doing stupid things with their freedom that, somebody comes along and says there ought to be a law, or they ought to be punished, or we ought to take care of that sort of thing. And we live in societies in which, in some respect, things are incredibly organized, and in other things are incredibly anarchic, where we're made prey to each other. The Grand Inquisitor is telling Christ, buddy, you screwed up. You had the power to do all these things, to organize not just a society, but the whole world, to give people things to believe in, to provide them with all the material comforts. You screwed up, so we're going to do that. And that's going to require that the masses, and even, some of the elites who think that they're, running the show but aren't really running the show, to lose their freedom, to give up their freedom, and we will exercise our freedom with this heavy burden of managing human life. So that's the story, right? And there's some more stuff at the end where, like, of course, the Christ kisses the Grand Inquisitor and then is gone, and then Alyosha kisses Ivan. We could talk about all that symbolism later, but this is the real crux of it. These three temptations, this drive to use freedom, to curb freedom, because of freedom's, you could say, anarchic and rebellious tendencies among human beings, all of which, seems to be quite accurate, not only in Dostoevsky's time, but in our time and in previous times. Now, what do we make of this politically? When does this Grand Inquisitor chapter get invoked? Well, oftentimes in terms of totalitarianism or totalizing tendencies, but I think that it is of wider application. I think that you could apply this even to those who are, paragons or champions of a certain kind of freedom. Freedom, understood in certain ways, isn't necessarily the freedom that in this story Christ came to bring. It can be a very selfish freedom. It can be you need to get your own, man, and screw everybody else kind of freedom. And that can be just as much the product of an ideology and a power structure as what the Grand Inquisitor is putting out. So we'll come back to this. I'm going to take some of the questions that people have here. Colomus points out Hannah Arendt talks about this in connection with Billy Budd in On Revolution. Great. There's lots and lots and lots of people talking about the Grand Inquisitor. What we want to put on the table is not just whether somebody talks about it, what do they actually have to say about this enigmatic poem of Ivan Karamazov. Giga Chad Mesh, how do you approach Dostoevsky in the classroom when there's more emphasis on critical thinking and liberal capitalist pedagogy? I don't know where you're getting this stuff from. If you think that there's something called liberal capitalist pedagogy and it's like a thing that is widespread in the classroom, a piece of fiction like this. Surely there's meditation on psychology, faith, and suffering instead. I have never encountered any problem teaching any of the texts that I want to teach in my over 20 years of teaching in a variety of different settings, teaching quite controversial stuff. And I also teach critical thinking as well, which I think is a good thing. So I don't even know what to make of that. How do I teach Dostoevsky? I go in and I teach it. It depends on what class we're doing. He's usually coming up in an existentialism class, but we could certainly do it. If I had the chance to teach a political theory class, I probably would use this passage. All right, Mark is here. Rhea says it's going good. Some back and forth stuff there. Rhea says that it's their dream to be a philosophy professor. So that's a tough one. A little bit of a digression here. I think all of you know that the job market for philosophy and the humanities to be a professor is pretty bad worldwide, right? It's not as if there are a lot of jobs in Europe, although they just sort of keep chugging along doing what they do. And there have been lots and lots of cutbacks and shifts away from having tenured professors to, more and more outsourcing to adjuncts in America and also to some degree in Britain, and I think this is starting to affect other places as well. So, let's come back to some of the themes that we could talk about coming from this. What would it take to actually have professors, um, as a secure class. I mean, not necessarily that everybody who's a professor deserves that. I mean, a lot of them are, talking about my peers, they're kind of a mixed lot, aren't they? Some of them are good and some of them are not so good. But would we have to have a new organization of society in order to make that work? And would that require something like what the Grand Inquisitor is proposing, people giving up some freedom in order to realize some other value? Um, in the kind of workplace that we're in, where is the freedom? Who has the freedom? That's the question to ask. I mean, going back to the question earlier about teaching Dostoevsky and critical thinking and liberal capitalist pedagogy. Okay, so some people actually do run into problems in the classroom and in their institutions, not typically from liberal capitalist pedagogy, but more often from like saying things that conservatives don't like. If you're in a particularly conservative area, and people can write letters or emails to the trustees or people like that, who, by the way, are usually just business types, and administrators are usually just business types these days. Or it could be that you're one of those lone conservatives who's getting persecuted by the far left in the academy, which happens much less frequently than people would like you to believe. Or it could be that you've done other things. Very often there's a lot of there's discrimination that happens on the basis of gender, race, or things like that. And then there's always the bad actors who are engaging in sexual harassment and getting away with it for years and years, and departments cover it up, or just doing other things that are less damaging but equally venial. And so there's lots of ways to be unfree in academia. I would tell you that actually from the perspective of somebody who has not just adjuncted, but knows a lot of other people who have been struggling for years and years to get a tenure track position, oftentimes without ever succeeding in it, that the unfreedom is primarily economic. Not knowing what classes you're going to teach next semester, or whether you're actually going to get classes, or that whether your classes are going to get poached by full-time people taking them. That makes for a rough life. I've seen people ground down by going from 1 to 2 year appointment to 1 to 2 year appointment, moving themselves across the country for a decade, and then finally just burning out. So what would it take? What sort of reconfiguration of society would we have to do in order to keep the people who have the freedom from exercising it in crappy ways that deny everybody else the exercise of their freedom? We would have to have something like a system, and we don't have an educational system in place. The United States has over 2,000 colleges and universities, some of which may be parts of a state system, but each of which is its own little universe, morally and fiscally speaking, and politically speaking. So, all right, Colamus says Arendt compares the Christ character with Billy Budd as people who transcend either virtue or law. I don't remember which. Yeah, I guess, I mean, that's sort of like what Deleuze's take is in, he's got this great essay that I did some videos on, called Bartleby or the Formula, and he's saying that they don't transcend the law. Actually, like Billy Budd gets caught up within the law, right? And it's the master at arms who is the character who evades the law altogether. All right, I'm not sure what this reference is to. Chugging along, treading water, more from what I hear from my mate. I'm not sure what I said that about before, but all right. Okay, so here's an interesting thing by Waterby. It's great. Professor Sadler is studying these classics. Many people are doing this. There's lots of people engaging with Dostoevsky or Plato or any of those people. Sometimes it feels like appreciation for these ways of thinking has disappeared. So that's a local problem. And we're fortunate that we live in this era of the internet. In the past, like when I was a college student, if you were on a campus where most of the people were kind of, just partiers and rum-dums and not particularly interested in reading great literature and talking about it, which wasn't entirely the case, well, you'd have to go somewhere to find that, right? You'd have to find some community elsewhere. It might be at, I don't know, like a coffee shop, or maybe you'd have to come down from Sheboygan down here to Milwaukee and try to find something. Now, if you want to find people who are interested in talking about Dostoevsky, all you got to do is put it into like Google, and Dostoevsky local group, book club, meetup, and you're going to find something. So it might not be good, right, any more than any other group is going to necessarily be good, but we're actually quite fortunate in that we have this massively interconnected world. Mark Smith, who's here, is from South Africa. He and I have been corresponding for years and years, and meeting up through video conferencing quite a bit, and talking about Aristotle and Arendt and sometimes Dostoevsky and sometimes other people. That just would not have been possible, back when I was a college student. I mean, we could correspond maybe through writing letters to each other, and who knows how long that would take, or making super expensive phone calls. But we are really quite fortunate. So I'm glad that you like that I and others are spreading these classics. But I don't think that appreciation for these ways of thinking has disappeared. As a matter of fact, I would say that there's more of that evident at this point in time. When we can have conversations on Twitter or Facebook or like this about these works, that's really quite awesome. All right. Mark asks, how does a conservative Catholic university admins respond to someone teaching the Grand Inquisitor? Do they see it as criticism of their bureaucratic authority? So that's a great question. To begin with, there's very few conservative universities. As a matter of fact, there's very few Catholic universities that call themselves Catholic universities. Marquette, just down the road, prime example of that. You could walk around, and other than some statuaries and some crucifixes in the classroom, there's nothing to tell you it's a Catholic university, because it's lost that ethos generations ago. And it did so in large part through a certain kind of conservatism that has nothing to do with culture and has everything to do with business and making money. Marquette's core, and this is the case for many Catholic colleges, Marquette's core curriculum has been gutted. Very little philosophy left, very little theology, very little even rhetoric and writing. And it's mostly oriented towards giving kids who want to go into dentistry or law or business, supply chain management is one of the big majors there these days, or get themselves a degree in psychology or communications. It's largely oriented towards professional schools and towards preparing people for the workplace. And all the Catholic stuff is basically just window dressing. Admins know nothing about what's going on within classes. Because when we're talking about admins, we're talking about the president and the vice presidents and the provost and the various deans and assistant deans. Unless something is brought to their attention, they don't have a clue about what's being taught. Even department chairs, rarely know what's going on in any particular person's class unless it's brought to their attention. This is the case everywhere, unless you've got like a real Budinsky kind of micromanager administrator. They don't know what's going on in people's classes, and they're not going to care if you're teaching Dostoevsky. They probably don't even remember what Dostoevsky had to say. Most of these people are just business types who, they had a veneer of liberal education back in the day, and they don't remember much of that. So, there's not a lot of worries about that sort of thing unless you get drawn to somebody's attention. Like you've got some intolerant student in your classroom from the left or the right who writes an email and they're like, I can't believe that so and so is teaching this, or how can this go on in this institution? And then they might be like, hey, academic freedom. If you don't like the class, suck it and get out of here. Go take another class. Or they might be like, oh, well, we need to crack down on this sort of thing. Totally random, So there isn't really that sort of worry for the most part. Again, unless you get drawn to somebody's attention. And that takes people doing work. I think that most people in administration, if they know anything about the Grand Inquisitor, it's probably because they took an existentialism class a long time ago, or maybe a poli-sci class where it was brought up, and it wouldn't really register on their radar. The fact that you're teaching Dostoevsky already makes it okay in their book because that's classic literature, right? Unless they're worried about decolonizing the curriculum, if they're one of those types, engaging in that practice, crusade, whatever we want to call it. And then they might be like, well, that's too Western or something like that. But it's not going to get you in trouble. So, all right. Waiterby says, I've been having the same ideas myself about having to create a new system of education, but they should be formed around a new civilizational outlook. So the education reproduces the system. I mean, but how are you going to get anybody to fund that or spread it or something like that? There isn't going to be a new system. If there's going to be new initiatives, it's not going to be in terms of a system. It's going to be in terms of doing something here locally with, the possibility of reaching people across the internet and then trying to replicate that in other places. We inhabit an incredibly pluralistic setting when it comes to education, and it's going to remain so. And it's going to remain, the only common elements are going to be the bureaucratic parts of it, like accreditation and the notion of classes being, 3 Carnegie hours per week, 15 weeks or things like that in order to get credit. But I don't see prospects for seizing control of the system. Like, let's say you became Secretary of Education here in the United States. Powerful position, right? One of the cabinet. Could you change American education, even if you didn't worry about the K through 12 stuff, you're just focusing on college and universities? Could you produce any really significant systematic changes? Probably not. Even with that amount of power, in part because we don't have a system. What Marquette does is maybe in line with, in terms of trends, what St. Anselm's College in New Hampshire is doing in terms of gutting the core and pretending to be a Catholic school. But each of them is a totally separate entity, and they do what they want to do, What Marquette does has nothing to do with what UW-Milwaukee does, has nothing to do with what Cardinal Stritch, which is a Franciscan university here in Milwaukee, does, has nothing to do with what Mount Mary College does, has nothing to do with what Concordia, a Lutheran college on the north side, does. All of these are separate institutions, and they're not really a system as such. So, all right, Oliver says, it's really interesting that in the European schools, philosophy and critical thinking is a mandatory subject in high school. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's not necessarily effective. I mean, I'm glad that they're teaching some philosophy, but having talked to plenty of people who took those classes, they're kind of hit and miss. I mean, some of my stuff actually gets used for the Portuguese national curriculum, who study philosophy in 10th and 11th grade. But that doesn't mean that any kid, like, I mean, I think about myself as a high schooler, right? I spent more time probably scribbling heavy metal stuff, like band logos and things like that on the desk. I'd probably spend more time doing that or sleeping than I did actually paying attention in class. So, I don't know that it makes that big of a difference. Let's see. Oliver says it's really interesting to work in an international high school and see how different cultures approach this aspect of pedagogy. Yeah, and even within the same culture, you can have a vast variety of approaches or responses, right? Parents can be like, oh man, I want my kid to be reading this stuff and exposed to great ideas so they can have a freedom of mind and, be a contributing member of society. And other parents can be like, I want my kid to go to this school because that's going to be a good diploma to have and it's going to get them into a good college and then they're going to have a good job. Other parents can be like, I don't really care what the hell my kid is doing. I just pay the money and it's nice for my kid to be there out of my hair. And there's like all these different possible responses, right? So, yeah. Let's see. Oh, here's an interesting speculation by Ringen. A new system will only come after a catastrophic collapse, sadly, in my view. Yeah, so this is a much bigger issue. How do we fundamentally change systems or whatever passes as a system for the better? What sort of circumstances would allow us to do that? Crises can sometimes afford that. And so, yeah, I think that, I mean, we do have some looming crises, don't we? I mean, we are in the middle of an environmental crisis. The stuff that's happening on the West Coast right now, with the massive temperature spikes and its effects on agriculture, which is going to affect the entire food system throughout the Americas, perhaps the world itself. That's a particular crisis. Can you use that to change education? I don't know, but you could use it to change some other things. What would be the factors that would allow you to change education? I mean, we're also living through another major crisis promoted by the factors of AI, logistics, robotics, a lot of jobs 20 years from now that we currently have are going to be gone. And we could be looking at something like 25 to 50% unemployment here in the United States. And our traditional way of been doing that is like, well, we'll train you for new jobs. And by the way, we'll give you some money to go to college for, to get a degree. Can we really do that anymore? That's another entire discussion. And, would you need somebody like the Grand Inquisitor and his ilk taking power to say, okay, we've got to manage this, or can we rely on the tech elites or the politicians to figure out the answers for these sorts of things? All right, Roughly Bumble writes, do you think if one of Plato's Republic guardians became dissatisfied and then disillusioned with the good divine? Oh, here's a good question. He'd become something like the Grand Inquisitor, a cynical shell of his former self. Yeah, I certainly do. I think that if you had Plato's Republic, I mean, think about how Plato's Republic depicts the fall of moving from one regime to the next, one more corrupt than the next in Republic Book 8. You move away from the aristocracy that he originally has, which, by the way, is not the ideal city. The ideal city is actually the simple city, the city that Plato's talking about from, the middle of book 2 onward is actually the city inflamed with lust and stuff like that. And so the guardians and the lesser guardians and the craftspeople, that's already a screwed up city. So you move to more and more screwed up cities. And why? Because people want wealth. They start hoarding it, and they want honor, and they lose sight of the rationality that's at play. Plato never, this is really interesting, this is going to be a bit of a tangent. One of the things that I point out to my students when we're talking about Republic Book 4 is that, Plato talks about the possibility of, the three parts of the soul being out of alignment with each other. And the most common problem is the appetites, the epithumii, the desires for sex, physical enjoyments, getting drunk, making money, all those sorts of things. Those dominate the soul, the lower parts, and then the higher parts serve them, right? And then there's another problem when the part of us that gets angry and desires honor, the thumos, when that's the thing running the show. And the main problem with logos, the rational part, is that it just doesn't have enough power by itself to coerce the appetites, and it needs thumos to help out. But my students point out, and I also point out if they don't realize it, that maybe it could become possible to be screwed up in the logike part, and that's still to dominate, And so maybe you could have somebody who's like, these friggin' guardians, they get things wrong all the time, and they're not actually like producing the great society. I'm going to figure out how to take power from within and manage this, and we can have some of those smart dummies as figureheads, but I'm going to run the show, and maybe a few of the rest of us will run the show from the back end. I think, that would be a story that could be told. I think you can say that is something that we see in speculative fiction, but I'm struggling to think of exactly who. I mean, so Philip Jose Farmer in the Riverworld series, some of the ethicals, the people who are actually like structuring everything and running the show, revolt against each other, and try to subvert it from within, and it actually leads to a big screw up. All right, so I think I lost the thread here. Here we go. Mark says, what comparisons would I draw between Prince Mishkin and the idiot and the Grand Inquisitor story? Mishkin's character arc seems like a parallel to what happens to Christ in some ways. Well, I mean, there's a big difference in that, first of all, the idiot's a whole novel. This is just a little chapter. Christ doesn't say anything in the Grand Inquisitor chapter. The only thing he does is some miracles, loves the people, and then kisses the Grand Inquisitor, right? Whereas Mishkin is a main character who's like, talking with all sorts of people and kind of bumbling around. He's got some insight into human psychology. He's Christ-like in that he suffers. He's not Christ-like in that he like does miracles or anything like that, or radically fixes the whole thing. Or, I mean, does I guess the real question you could ask is, does Mishkin bring people, the other characters that he's involved with, does he bring them freedom? Does he raise the problematic of their freedom to a higher level? And maybe the answer is yes in the case of some of the characters. It's been a while since I've looked at the idiot, but maybe I need to go back to it. So, all right, Giga Chadmesh, sorry for my poor phrasing and question. Thanks for answering. Would you say Dostoevsky's own life, exile, seeing execution? What's the reference there? There was a mock execution that he was part of for being convicted as a traitor, and then he was sent to Siberia after that. That was a real kick in the pants to him. Had shaped his political views. Is biography helpful for analysis? Yeah, biography is always helpful for analysis, not just for Dostoevsky, but for many others. But you, of course, don't want to reduce. You can reduce in second-rate thinkers their ideas to just biographical stuff. But in the case of first-rate thinkers, biography is one factor that figures in. And yeah, I mean, you can see it in the development of his works, right? He goes from being what at that time was, sort of a progressive liberal, along sort of European lines, to being this person who's got a much darker, deeper conception of human nature and its problematics, and can bring in characters, develop characters who are so different from each other and yet so well drawn out that at a certain point, I think Bakhtin is right. Just as with Shakespeare, you cannot identify Dostoevsky's voice with any one of his characters. Bakhtin has this wonderful book, Problems of Dostoevsky's Poetics, that I would check out. Kolomus, sometimes when people learn something badly, it makes them think they understand and then treat something they know it all about, and therefore they can dismiss it. Yeah, or dismiss it or like hold on to it like a talisman, right? Critical thinking is a great example of this. I don't know how many people outside of philosophy use this word critical thinking to describe their classes and what they're promoting in their students, and you look at their curriculum and you're like, this isn't critical thinking. This might be teaching people to be a little critical about things, but there's very little about structure of argumentation or understanding of biases and fallacies or learning how to make and break an argument or any of that sort of stuff. People, latch on to buzzwords, and then they think they know all about it. I posted an article today about postmodernism, what it is, what it isn't. There have been so many people in recent years who have been like, and postmodernism is ruining everything, and you're like, you don't have a clue what postmodernism means, So now it's critical race theory, right? All these people on the right are like, critical race theory, slashed my tires. It's destroying our culture, and you're like, what does it actually mean? And they'll give some definition, and it's a bullshit definition. They don't know what they're talking about, and really what they're upset about is teaching accurate information about how race has worked out in our society. And we could go on and on and on about this sort of thing, right? So you're right. Yeah, people learn something badly, and they are learning something, right? But they are learning it badly. They think they understand it, and then they can treat it as something else. Just like people read the Grand Inquisitor chapter, all about like, and the government is not going to take away my freedom, and you're like, that's not exactly what the main thrust of this is here. So them, raising your property tax or saying that you can't walk around with a gun anywhere is not the Grand Inquisitor taking away human freedom entirely, but people do that. So, all right, Mark has a comment about decolonization. I think Dostoevsky's writing would actually be interesting to incorporate. A lot of the environment of the story seems to deal with the tension in Russia with westernization or Europeanization of its culture and the effect that it has on its society. Seems a fruitful insight when it's thinking of its impact elsewhere. Yeah, and so I'm going to go on a little bit of a rant here. Decolonization here in the United States typically means we need to have less white male authors and more representatives from other things, right? And white is understood along the sort of typical census lines, right? Are you European in any way? You're white. Are you Middle Eastern? You're white. Unless you get far enough into the Asian subcontinent, in which case you're Asian, right? So like a Pakistani would be considered Asian, whereas an Iranian would be considered white. And this is just entirely ridiculous. I mean, so there's quite a few people that are calling for decolonization and are doing so in crude and clumsy and counterproductive ways. That said, what we do want to have is a greater diversity of voices. And Mark is entirely right that this problematization of European versus Russian, this is not a white thing. This is a different kind of thing that was going on throughout Russian literature. I mean, Dostoevsky is part of that. So is Gogol. So is Turgenev. These great, 19th century writers. it's a problematic that extends into the 20th century with thinkers like Lev Shestov, right? So this is a really good insight. We need to, without turning it into the sort of typical American thing, like, well, I'm Italian American, so therefore, that's my ethnicity, or I'm Irish American. Instead, we think about it in terms of problematic ethnicities, right? And where we draw lines and things like that. So yeah, considering not in terms of the Grand Inquisitor, but in terms of Dostoevsky's other writings, this problematic of, well, do you want to become a Westerner? Is that part of becoming just one big happy rationality like in The Underground Man, or is there something that's without getting all mystical, the Russian approach to things? J. Cross, the white, I feel visual art is in a major crisis. Guidance is poor at best through the university system. Many teachers are validating their own failed styles, and objective teaching is a rare blessing. So you could say that, I suppose, locally, but unless you've actually done like some sort of study about art schools or what's going on, I would be very suspect about these sweeping claims about teachers are validating their own failed styles and objective teaching is a rare blessing. Art has been in crisis the entire 20th century and into the 21st century. This is actually nothing new. This has been going on for generations and generations, and yet it seems to like churn away. I will tell you this: working at a school of art and design, that the biggest concerns that I see are less conceptual and more about the stranglehold that financial elites have over the art world because of all the auction and the buying and selling and the sort of star system and stuff like that. I don't see, I mean, certainly the stuff that you're saying in your comment, I don't see that happening at Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design. Might be happening at the Art Institute in Chicago. I don't know, because I don't teach down there. The biggest concerns are really more like business and finance co-opting art and making it very arbitrary who gets to display and who doesn't get to display. So. Oh, here's a very good question from Michael. What would you say to someone who wants to read classic books in philosophy and literature, but who is intimidated by them? So this is a perennial issue, right? And when I think about this on the spot right now, there's being intimidated by the books, but I'm willing to bet that for a lot of people, the intimidation is not just the books themselves and the authors themselves. It's an intimidation from other people, other readers, other teachers of the stuff who will tell you, you'll never understand this. You're not good enough. You're stupid, or things like that, right? Lurking in the background, being worried about being made fun of. This is the thing that keeps students from raising their hand in class and advancing an idea about the book, which is very often on point, because they're worried about what other people are going to say, that they're going to laugh at them. I think that's part of the issue. And when you have those sort of like voices in the back of your head, there's nothing that says that you can't say screw you to them. It is tough though, right? And there's some legitimate reasons for thinking that books like Brothers Karamazov are going to be difficult. Dostoevsky is grappling with major ideas that through the mouths of his and thoughts of his characters, and it's also about a different time and place, so that presents certain problems. If you read Plato's Symposium, you're being transported back into 4th century Greece, BC, right? And a very different milieu in which sexuality is understood in ways and through categories that we don't really usually typically look at it in our own time, and even politics is being understood differently. So those are factors that could make for a bit of intimidation, actually a lot of intimidation. And I guess the thing that you could say about that is it's okay to feel intimidated. That by itself doesn't have to hold you back from reading. And the first time that you read, you're going to miss most of what's going on. And then you'll realize that the next time that you read, you know? And you'll realize that also through talking with other people who care about classic literature and get excited about it. And it's okay. You don't have to jump from, bare beginner level to mastery level or even intermediate. It's okay not to know everything. It's okay to be confused by parts or to feel yourself out of your depth. That's all right, because that doesn't keep you from being able to keep working at it, right? Um, what keeps you from continually working at it is some sort of voice in the back of your head that says, "Oh, you suck. You didn't get this right away. You're never going to figure this out." And that's not an oracle that knows your future or anything like that. Very often, that's again the reflection of assholes who've said assholish things to us about literature. Um, they could be professors, they could be parents, they could be fellow students. But if you lend yourself to it, you will find the book does some of the work after a while. That sounds a little confusing, I know, but so the long story short, if you do feel intimidated, that's okay. You don't have to be intimidated, and you can keep working at it. All right, let's see. Just skipped a little bit. B says the man who was Thursday versus the Grand Inquisitor. I don't see a versus there. What would be the lines on which we would compare or contrast them? The man who was Thursday was a great, Chestertonian novel. This is a chapter from the Brothers Karamazov. All right. Mark says you said you usually teach Dostoevsky in an existentialism course. Have you ever taught him in a Christian philosophy course? How would you incorporate him, and would you focus on his thought? I've never taught a Christian philosophy course, a course specifically on Christian philosophy. I think that would be one of those courses where it would be so difficult. Usual triage of like, man, I'd like to teach this and this and this, and I get 15 weeks, and I don't know that I would actually have Dostoevsky in that because there's so many other people to get to. All right, let's see here. A bunch of new comments just popped up. Kaito Loveboat, I think an understanding of Russian history and Orthodox theology is important for understanding the great Russian thinkers of the 19th century. Yeah, yes and no. I would say in order to understand Gogol, you don't need to really know much about Eastern Orthodoxy. It probably helps a bit with Dostoevsky, depending on which novel you're reading. I don't think you actually need to know much about it in order to understand The Possessed or The Demons or, Notes from the Underground. It certainly does help, given that one of the characters is, essentially a postulant, right? To know it for this book. But I don't think you need to know an awful lot about Orthodox theology to appreciate much of Russian literature. Russian history helps to some degree, but how much British history do you need to know in order to appreciate Chesterton? Not all that much. A lot of it will be supplied on the way. Everything helps, right? But it's not a prerequisite, I would say. Mark says, on the one hand, I could see the freedom that we're saved from is like what Sartre would call bad faith. The Inquisitor feeds us, gives us a role, and then frees me from choice. Yeah, I mean, like bad faith could be a component in it. It's actually like a much wider system that the Inquisitor and his buddies are projecting and trying to put into place, that, like, it's like a totalitarian system in effect. And it doesn't necessarily, it could be totalitarian in the sense of totalizing without having like a totalitarian government. Like, you could think of this in terms of certain corporations and their little portion of the world and what they're trying to do with it, as being kind of similar. All these TED style talks where a tech guy gets up and he's like, we're going to change everything for the better, just put the power in our hands. They're kind of like little Grand Inquisitors, aren't they? All right. Connor says, I want to see how this connects to political theory. Well, we talked about that at the start. This has to do with the use of human freedom, and the Grand Inquisitor is talking about political organization. That's the third great temptation, right? So, all right, let's see. Luke has, this goes back to the question that was raised about being intimidated by Michael, who asked about being intimidated by philosophical and literary works. For me, it's the idea I need to be an expert in order to share my thoughts with people. Just skipped a little bit. With people in a way that will benefit them. Fear that I will advise them foolishly. You could easily deal with that by preceding what you're going to say to them with, I'm not an expert, but here's my take. I do understand that, and this is part of what people are always saying, like, why don't you do, videos on Chinese philosophy? And I'm like, listen, I teach it in class, but I'm not an expert on that. And I'm leery of putting stuff out there as resources for people that I'm not particularly, good at or versed in. So I understand that impulse, but you could frame it in such a way that you don't have to be an expert to contribute. And that's in part how you improve and get better. Let's see. Oh, we're a little bit over time. I'm gonna kind of bring this to a close. So here's a good question. Gig Chad Mesh asks, if the Grand Inquisitor revamped academia, if we do require a class of intellectuals in the polis, how would classism, snobbery, or caste be abolished? I don't know that it would be, right? Classism is the idea that, I guess, that some classes are better than others, and in that kind of organization, some classes are better than others, right? Snobbery exists pretty much every society, and it's not just intellectuals, it's also pseudo-intellectuals who engage in that. Caste, that depends on how you organize your society, right? So having a class of intellectuals doesn't necessarily mean having a caste of intellectuals, right? Analog tips. Is there any parallel between the bread the Grand Inquisitor offers and the COVID restrictions put in place by current states? No, there is no parallel between that. That's kind of a funny thing to bring up. I've talked about this with other people. If this were like 20 years ago, when I was younger and the culture I remember, the kind of COVID restrictions that we had, people would have accepted them. It's because we have this toxic emphasis on my freedom and individuality, and that the Republican Party here in the States and similar parties in other places have exploited, where people are like really delusional about this kind of stuff, that people view it as a massive infringement of their freedom. We're in some serious problems because of that, but that's a whole other thing to talk about, I think, in some other time. Let me see if there was something else that I saw. Okay, so Mark says, over a course of comments, coming back to the Grand Inquisitor, Jesus' death was to free us from sin, so we're free to try to earn our own salvation. free from trying to both alleviate responsibility from me. Jesus respects the freedom of the will. Yeah, you could say not just his death, but his life and his teachings too, right? That's part of what Ivan is having the Grand Inquisitor credit Jesus with. He's like, you came here and you just made things more complicated for everybody. Let me see if I can find the actual. Here we go. Instead of taking over men's freedom, you increased it and forever burdened the kingdom of the human soul with its torments. You desired the free love of human beings, that they should follow you freely, seduced and captivated by you, instead of the firm ancient law. Human beings had to decide for themselves with a free heart what is good and evil, having only your image before them as a guide. Did it not occur to you they would eventually reject and dispute even your image and your truth if they were oppressed by so terrible a burden as freedom of choice? That is what the Inquisitor is saying the fundamental problem is. And now, to go back to the question about like Christian philosophy, one of the key ideas that came out in the Christian philosophy debates is that Christianity, through its culture, intellectual life, practices, put new ideas and experiences on the table that then philosophy in its rational workings can take, unpack, unfold. This would be one of them. The nature of human freedom, the capacity to determine our own wills, how to live up to a model, a very difficult model, both displayed and also taught, like, for example, in the Sermon on the Mount. Those are some really interesting things that would connect back to this Brothers Karamazov chapter. So, good time to close things up. I got a lot of work I got to do on my online classes for the summer. They are starting in my Intro to Philosophy class, Plato's Symposium, this coming week. So I've got to knock off. And good discussion as always. We'll do another one of these next month. Haven't decided what the topic will be yet, but I'll be posting that, like in the next week or so. You'll see it in the video channel. Thanks to everybody for their questions and comments, and I'll see you in some other online events.